Let's go to the 20th century. Talk about, if you would, President Roosevelt and President Truman.
Well, FDR in 1940 was running for a third term. Isolationist country, probably 70%, would you say? And so if he were someone who was just motivated to get another term, he would have essentially said to Americans, I will never get involved in the war, and I don't think we need to build up our defense, because if there's a big defense, big military, that might lead to war. That would have helped him politically. Instead, he said, if I do that, I may win a third term, but we will be undefended, we Americans, if we have to fight Hitler in a Second World War. And so therefore what he did in this very odd campaign was, to the extent that he could, he said to Americans, there might be the possibility that we might have to stand up to Hitler. We have to build up our military. He almost lost the election because of that to Wendell Willkie. But there's a great exchange that sort of shows his view. Joseph Kennedy, the father of JFK, was his ambassador to London, famous isolationist. And after the election, Kennedy, who hated Roosevelt for trying to do things that might lead to war, said to Roosevelt, you're either going to be the greatest president in history, greater than Washington or Lincoln, or you're going to be the biggest horse's ass. And this was really effrontery. People didn't usually talk to Roosevelt that way, as you well know. And Roosevelt replied, there's another alternative, Joe. Unless I build up our defense, I may wind up being the president of a very unimportant country. He knew the difference.
It is. The strength of the book and the strength of your canon of work is that flawed men and women can do great things. What did you learn that surprised you the most in doing this book?
In Harry Truman's case, the fact that his decision to recognize Israel in 1948, which really meant the difference between there being a Jewish state or not being a Jewish state, that it was such a close-run thing. He was torn very strongly in both directions. On one side, his Secretary of State, the heroic George Marshall, saying, I'm against this, I'm going to oppose you if you recognize a Jewish state. I might even vote against you in the next election that year, 48, if he were to vote. And on the other side, Truman, feeling historically and even religiously as a Missouri Baptist, he knew how important it would be to not only provide shelter for Jews who were refugees after the Holocaust, but to allow the Jews to have a homeland after 2,000 years. At the same time, he had to go home in the evenings to his wife Bess, who was no partisan for a Jewish state. She would not let Jewish people into her house in Independence, Missouri. So here he is surrounded by all these forces and somehow finds his way through to supporting a Jewish state, probably one of the most important decisions a president has ever made.
President Bush, who has a narrative in his mind about the war on terror and Iraq, and he, I think, and I think our reporting shows, has decided that in 25 years we will say this was the right thing to do. We were all wrong and you were right. Do you think there's any way to judge in the moment whether the stubbornness is a virtue or a vice, or do we have to wait?
I think we usually do have to wait, although on Iraq it's getting more and more difficult to imagine a scenario by which the Iraq decision would turn out so well that in 20 or 30 years we would all say, thank God George Bush went to war in Iraq. I doubt if even he says that to himself in his heart of hearts right now. But, another case I deal with, as you know, is Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan and the Cold War. If we were sitting here in 1983, a lot of people we know would have said, Reagan is crazy. He's risking World War III. He's being too tough on the Soviets. What is all this about? In retrospect, many of the people I know who were the most exercised about Reagan at the time, in retrospect, will say, thank God Ronald Reagan was president because he was able to use that strength to end the Cold War. So it does sometimes change.
Presidential Courage, Brave Leaders and How They Changed America, 1789 to 1989, a small canvas. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, John.